Well, hello there. Welcome. My name is Brianna, and I'm super excited to welcome Kyle Benson here with me today. We are back again, going to be talking about some really wonderful questions that have come up in our respective audiences around love and attachment. And so, Kyle, I'm just going to introduce myself and then hand it over to you to share a bit about who you are. My name is Brianna McWilliam, and I'm an author, educator, and licensed creative arts therapist, and I've been in the field for about 13 years. And I am excited about love and attachment in adult relationships specifically, and I help individuals struggling with insecure attachment go from feeling kind of fearful and insecure in their relationships to standing much more sovereignly in themselves and also in the context of partnership. So, Kyle, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome introduction. Hi, I'm Kyle, Kyle Benson. I'm an intentionally intimate relationship coach. I really work with couples and individuals who really want to feel connected and cherished by their partners. And I do that by using research-proven tools. I actually work in a love lab where we hook couples up to all this little wiring and data that collects the physiological data, and we code their conversations. And so I use a lot of the stuff I've learned in that experience as well as in my personal experiences to help couples really reconnect over issues that have caused them to be divided, and help individuals really stand authentically within themselves to have a relationship that is worth having.
Also a lovely introduction. So today we wanted to talk about a question. So Kyle, I think I'm going to have you read the question because you had a good...
Yeah. So the question is, how do I have a romantic date with a partner who I feel distant from?
Good question. So, well, I can answer the first part of that, which is that sometimes I think that the distance in our relationships is usually because there's sort of three elements that are not necessarily being attended to. And this is not to blame one partner or the other, but usually it's because there's a habit of way of being and communicating and relating to one another that has become kind of a groove in the relationship. And so we start to experience that distance. And that is feeling acknowledged and or respected. That, to my mind, romance is kind of an extension of feeling acknowledged and respected. The second thing is feeling nurtured and supported by our partner. And lastly, feeling sexy and desirable. And creativity, I think, is a big part of how we assist our partners in feeling sexy and desirable. So first, I mean, I would ask you, Kyle, does that sound like something that you would agree with?
Totally. And I think I also want to add one little bit into that question. We're kind of focusing this on a Valentine's Day because that's coming up. And so, you know, it's particularly a day where you get a lot of reminders of, oh, you need to go on a date. There's a lot more pressures to buy gifts and to bring out this romantic feeling. And Brianna and I are going to be talking about how you really want to cultivate that feeling year long. And you really want to build a culture, you know, of appreciation and acknowledgement, of cherishing one another, and also making time for feeling sexually desired and attractive. And so, yeah, I just completely agree with that. And actually the research from Dr. John Gottman in his love lab that he had 40 years ago that I work in now, that validates all that stuff. And it's so important to be really intentional in the culture you create in your relationship. And a great metaphor that I like to talk about, it's kind of like a plant, right? So I actually have this plant over in my office here that I've had for a while, and it's a great looking plant, but if I don't water it, it's going to die. And like with your partner, they need that nourishment. They need that affection. They need to know that they're appreciated. I could look at the plant and say, oh yeah, I'm mentally watering it. I love the plant. But unless I actually take action to give the plant nutrients and give it water, it's not going to grow. It's going to die. And that's what a relationship happens too. When we forget to do these things, when we don't do these things, it causes a lot of disconnection in the relationship. And so I really want to reinforce kind of what Brianna's saying is it really is starting with these three different layers and intentionally building them into your relationship. So why don't we start diving on with layer one and kind of talking about the acknowledgement? And I'd love to have you start off, and then I'll kind of add some stuff into it.
Sure. So, I mean, it's really just about asking yourself and also asking your partner, you know, what would make my partner feel acknowledged and respected? How do you know that? What have you witnessed between within your interactions and within the relationship that makes you know that? And also, if you can't acknowledge respect or give acknowledgement and respect, then typically people are less willing and are open to receive nurturance and support because they don't trust it, right? It doesn't feel very authentic. And, it's not really a hard thing to ask. Sometimes just by asking your partner, is there anything that you would like me to acknowledge about our relationship or about you or about our relationship? And sometimes even asking the question just feels like an acknowledgement to your partner. And I feel like oftentimes your partner's probably going to have a pretty easy answer, because these are the kinds of things that we tend to store in our heads and kind of ruminate around, but maybe not necessarily share right away, right? And then the second part of that, of course, is following up the question with, well, what can I do or say to help you feel more acknowledged and respected throughout, like you said, throughout the year or throughout the course of the relationship on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. And I really feel like if someone answers that for you, honestly, it's almost like they're giving you those glasses at the movie theater for the 3D movie. It's like you bring them into real dimensionality. Like you are seeing them and you are acknowledging them as their own separate person and individual, just by asking, basically, you're asking the question, where are your boundaries? Where does the line between you and me exist? And how can I acknowledge that and respect that and cherish that? I think it is worthwhile noting, however, that sometimes, especially if you have insecure partners, that they're really terrible at expressing their needs or knowing what their needs are. So if you have a partner that has difficulty identifying what makes them feel acknowledged or what would make them feel respected, maybe they don't have a history of being acknowledged and respected very much, so they may feel a bit stunted by the question, well, I don't know. Right? Well, everything's fine. Oh, you're good. What you're doing is just perfect. Right? It's not necessarily that they're trying to be withholding or something like that, but it may be that they don't really have a language for that. I think a lot of times we're not really taught how to have emotionally honest conversations. And so as a result, we may not have the language with which to respond to a question like that. Right? In which case it becomes a task of being sure to ask those questions on a regular basis and opening up the space to explore a little bit more about it, right? Having maybe a few follow-up questions, in the context of the relationship that can help you and your partner start to outline what is acknowledgement and what is respect in this relationship.
Yeah, I'm going to actually reinforce that kind of with my own language because, what Brianna's saying is so important. And the first part of creating that culture of respect and admiration is so important, because when you don't have that respect, what happens is you're either looking down at your partner from above them, which isn't very relationally, or you're one below them. And so you have this one up and one down type of relationship, and it does not make it healthy. It makes it really difficult to resolve conflict. And if you're in this one up position, typically what you're going to do is you're going to use contempt. And contempt is when you're going to kind of look at your partner with disgust. You're going to look at them in a way that says you are above them and they are inferior. And that blows respect out of the water. And Dr. Gottman, he says contempt is the sulfuric acid of love. And so you have to really be mindful of what is coming out of your mouth, what position you are taking in that psychically, and really lower yourself down and take kind of the judgments out of things and realize that you have a partner who's different than you, right? That's the glasses Brianna was talking about, is putting those on to acknowledge that you're two different people and that you have to start to bridge the gap of disconnection and misunderstanding that is so common in relationships. But that starts from going down to the same level as your partner and seeing each other as equals and building a culture of fondness and admiration, which is really for respect. And some great ways to do that, right? Brianna was talking about acknowledgments. The words I would be using is appreciations, right? Noticing the things your partner does on an ongoing basis, right? The little things, whether they cook dinner or took out the trash, appreciating that, but then weaving in a trait of their character. And so it's very easy to say, oh, well, thanks for taking out the trash, right? And that's helpful. But you can add a little extra layer to that and say, thanks for taking out the trash. I really appreciate how aware you are of making sure our home is clean. Or thank you for being there for me and just listening to me vent about my work stuff. I love how caring you are towards me, right? Mm-hmm. Adding that extra little layer not only acknowledges the effort they put in, but also acknowledges who they are. And that also really builds a culture of kind of love and respect. And so that's really important. And that's kind of that first layer that Brianna is talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Mm-hmm. The other thing one more thing I would add to it is that sometimes I think what might be difficult for us to have conversation like this, because I know at least some of my audience might be hearing this and be like, oh my God, I'd be terrified to have that conversation with someone, is part of it is that when we can talk a little bit more about it also in the second piece, but this idea of boundaries, that sometimes, especially if we come from a place of insecurity, we've experienced boundaries as being a form of severance. And there's this sense of like, if we are in this kind of merged state and if everything is going well, then we shouldn't have to have those conversations. And there's like this feeling of like, if I acknowledge my separateness or my partner's separateness, then it's actually an establishment of a boundary. And that feels like a severance. Like that can stimulate fears of abandonment or fears of being criticized or fears of becoming one up or one down. Right. So part of it too is having a comfortability with boundaries and realizing that it's actually once you can start having those conversations and be aware of the boundaries of each of you in the relationship, that's actually really sexy. And that can actually enliven the conversation.
Right? Yeah, I want to toss on that just really quickly. Sorry for the interruption, but yeah, no, this is so important because, right, when we're really close and we don't really acknowledge our partners as completely different than us, we get into a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. But when we establish those boundaries and acknowledge that they're different than us and accept and love them and work with them in a way, that's actually where real intimacy is developed, right? Because you're not so connected that you can't tell who's who, but there's space for both people to exist as their unique person and still be connected. And that is really mature love at its highest level. It's being able to acknowledge those differences that Brianna's talking about. And so I just wanted to throw that in there because you're talking about something so important.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so the second thing that I had mentioned was support and nurturance. So I believe that unless the acknowledgement or the appreciation and the respect is there, it's really hard to be open and willing to receive at all, but to receive is specifically support and nurturance because you don't trust it. I feel like I feel like being willing to receive something, especially support and nurturance, kind of requires a kind of an emotional surrender or a form of vulnerability, because a lot of us walk around with this attitude, whether or not we voice it aloud, but we kind of have it going on inside of us, which is, I can do it myself. Or if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself, that type of attitude, or I can control everything, right? And it's because we're not trusting others to really show up consistently for us when we need them. And that gets communicated to a partner that you don't trust them. And so they get that widens the gap between you and the partner, right? And also, I would say that if you have a partner that doesn't seem to know how to let you in or who feels distant because they don't seem to need and or want your support, it would be important to realize that opening up to receive support means that you are opening up to deeper and deepening levels of intimacy, right? On an emotional level. And it is a form of vulnerability and expression. Did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're talking about is you're talking about the way these people have grown up, right? Their attachment styles. They have these internal working models regarding to trust, commitment, whether they can rely on other people, whether they can take the risk of saying, hey, can you support me with this? Can I depend on you? Can I trust you? And for people who have that insecure attachment styles, right now, they really struggle with that, right? People who have avoidant styles struggle to take the risk of letting someone in to see kind of more what's going on or really trusting on them. And they adapted earlier on in their lives to have this independent mindset. I have to do everything myself. I can't rely on people because that's what they needed earlier on in their life with whatever was going on. But now it's also causing issues in terms of intimacy because they're not really reaching out for support. They kind of just do things by themselves. They're because that's what they're used to. Or there's the anxious style, which is you want to trust, you want to depend, but you're so scared that if you do, it's going to fail or they're not going to be there. And so you might take some risk, but you also add a lot of controlling into it. And it makes it really hard for your partner to have the space to earn that trust that you really want to have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the discomfort of tolerating that discomfort and taking that step back and letting your partner actually show up to the relationship. That's really hard. So I just wanted to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and adding on to that, I would say too, sometimes we've grown up in these environments where if someone gives you something, they're going to expect something in return down the line, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't want to receive anything because I don't want to be indebted, right?
And they struggle to that. And then also what's interesting is because they have that model, right, of I don't want to receive anything, they also struggle to give compliments. Right. So they might struggle with saying the appreciations or acknowledgements or cherishing you, because for them, they don't want to be cherished because that opens up that vulnerability. And that's also another thing I've seen with some of the couples I've worked with. I've actually had one partner who I'm like, you know, I see how hard it is for you to actually accept that love and that affection and that connection. And I also noticed that you also struggle to give it out too, because you know, and it's twofold, right? If you struggle to receive it, you're going to struggle to give it. And so it's that opening yourself up to kind of accepting those things and allowing yourself to be able to receive those, and also intentionally giving those types of compliments to your partner or acknowledging how sexy they are, and really kind of stepping into that vulnerable place that can really build that a more emotional intimacy in the relationship, which again goes back to that internal model of if you have had difficulties with emotional intimacy or closeness, right, your history is going to come back up and it's going to be impacting how you behave in the present. And so that's kind of the work that you will have to do to move closer to your partner as you engage in this process of building your relationship.
And I would add to that, I think the person who struggles with receiving may also struggle with giving. I think that's one type. Yes. I think there's also another type who just gives and doesn't know how to receive. And I refer to that, I have like 4 types of emotional boundaries that I talk about sometimes, and one of them is the guard. And I refer to that as the guard. So, and I believe that anxious people and avoidant people can be guards. Oh, yeah. So for example, an anxious guard will be like, they will give a lot, and they typically, if they need something or they want something, they have what's called kind of a reaction formation, but they will give precisely what it is that they want. Mm-hmm. So, and then when you try to offer it, oh, no, it's okay, I don't need it. Because then they can give, because in some ways it satisfies the desire for it, but they can't receive it for the reasons that we have just outlined, which is that it's too vulnerable and it's a loss of control to receive. So it's kind of like let's say anxious guard had a bad day and their pet got hit by a car, right? So friend says, oh my gosh, that's so terrible, it's so awful, you know, how can I support you in this? And like, oh, I know it's terrible, but I'll get over it, you know, I'll work through it. Meanwhile, I know you're having a hard time. What can I do for you? How can I support you? Right?
The pleaser.
Right. Whereas the guard, who is more avoidant, will say, oh, wow, that's terrible, I'll leave you alone. Mm-hmm. You know, like their perception is, oh, you want to be left alone because you're having a tough feeling. Whereas, you know, the guard who's more anxious will be like, this is a tough feeling and I'm going to work it out by giving somebody else love and support.
Which comes so much from our attachment styles as we grew up, right? That mindset of I'm going to leave you alone is how that avoidant was, right? They were kind of left alone to do things by themselves. And so when they see you hurting, the way they usually deal with their hurt is they just go into isolation. Mm-hmm. And so that's what they're kind of expecting you to do. And so while you feel your partner doesn't care about you, they're actually treating you the way they would treat themselves.
Way they assume, right, exactly, right. The way they interpret care.
Right, and that's the same for the anxious, right? That oh, I'm hurting, but when I was hurting and my mom or my dad was upset, I had to go caretake for them. I had to deal with their emotions. So I'm hurting, but hey, how are you? Let's talk about what's going on for you, because I don't want to get into my stuff, because that means something else is going to happen or trouble's coming up. Because that was the experience as that anxious individual, whether that's in childhood or earlier relationships. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's again recognizing your style of relating. And, you know, I love how you talked about we might give a lot, but we have this wall, this shield we put up that prevents people from coming in. And that's kind of that pleaser boundary issue where, right, you have to work into kind of putting that shield down with someone who you can trust and to let them start to be there for you.
Right. I mean, sorry. I didn't interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
We all have that like mother or aunt or friend who always goes out of their way for you, to gets you things, thinks of you, gives you things you said you didn't even want. Mm-hmm. And then you find something for them. And you go and you bring it to them and like, oh, you shouldn't have. No, really, you shouldn't have. No, you should take that back. You should save your money. You shouldn't have. And it doesn't make you feel good. Like, it doesn't benefit you that they're refusing the thing that you're trying to give them.
Because you're trying to enter into a relationship, right? You're trying to have mutuality in the terms of, oh, you've given me some stuff. I care about you and I'm going to give you stuff unconditionally. But then when they
receive it.
What?
And then they don't receive it.
Right. Yep.
Because they've been taught that's how you show regard and affection, by not taking. Mm-hmm. Right. But then the person is left feeling rejected. Oh, they didn't want my gift. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this, I think, you and I have really gone away from kind of the date and diss it thing, but I mean, this is actually the foundational stuff underneath that, right? The reason.
That's how we arrive at the distance in the date.
right. How this all happened. And so like, while we started with this kind of higher question of, okay, how do you reconnect with someone who you're distant from for Valentine's Day? Right? We're getting there slowly, but we're really going into kind of the dirt of why you had that distance in the first place, and give you instructions to not only change it on that day, but change it in the relationship for the long haul, right? To raise the bar of your relationship and the emotional connection and conflict, so you can actually have a better and more satisfying relationship overall, rather than just on one day. So I just want to toss that in as we continue our conversation.
Yeah. And the other side of it, I would say too, is we've been talking more about the person who declines, but there's also the person who can't do anything for themselves and is always kind of leaning on a partner. Mm-hmm. And really the basis of that is a fundamental distrust of themselves. Mm-hmm. So in that case, showing support of a partner like that may look different. So for example, demonstrating that you have faith that that person can do whatever it is for themselves. And it may be that rather than trying to fix that partner's problem for them, it's more about empathically listening to the struggles they may be having and being present with that emotionally, as opposed to jumping into fix-it mode, which is only going to continue to keep that person in a disempowered state, which they continue to distrust their feelings and or their abilities. And if all you do is jump in and fix it, you're just communicating to them that you don't trust their capacity to follow through. And so, and like maybe they even whine and throw an adult temper tantrum if you don't do it for them. But part of loving them and acknowledging, no, I know you are a capable person, is putting up with the tantrum until they see and witness that, no, you really do have faith in my ability to do it, even if I don't have faith in my own ability. Right. Yeah.
And that's that's another boundary issue, right, that we're bringing up, is that these people, because of their childhood, their parents kind of protected them, they parented them, they took care of the problems for them. And so the way they've learned to resolve their problems is to make a big fit until someone solves it for them. And so, loving a partner who kind of acts childlike in that way, typically they also find someone who is very parent-like and will try to resolve all the issues, will fix it. But that makes it really, what?
They're magnetized to each other.
Yeah, because of those different ways of relating. And then you get into problems because that parent person doesn't feel like a partner, and they feel frustrated because they're always having to babysit this other one, and the other one is kind of rebelling because they're like, oh, well, I got a parent who I'm in love with. And Esther Perel talks about how it's really hard to have a really satisfying sex life when you have that dynamic going on. And so what Brianna's saying is so wise, is you actually have to, if you have that type of partner, give them the trust to do things by themselves and support them in the difficulties. I hear that's difficult for you. I'm not going to make the decision for you. Why don't you try making this decision yourself, and we can talk about it, but not to do it for them, because that's where their growth is going to happen. And that's actually going to create more intimacy in your relationship, because instead of them being childlike, they're going to start to be more partner-like. But the other thing is, you also have to give up your parenting of your partner. That's the cost for you if you are taking that parenting role. And that's a tough one, especially if you're the type of person who likes to be the helper or the fixer or take responsibility for people's emotions. you have to be willing to let that go and be able to support your partner in their struggles without taking over their struggles for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I refer to this as the rescuer.
Yeah.
And on a deeper level, sometimes when we find ourselves in rescuer dynamics, it's in part because when we have a partner who misbehaves, in some ways, it always puts us in the right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're always rescuing a partner, then that means that you are always safely on the right and high moral side of the fence.
Which makes you feel good.
Right. And there's that up and down dynamic that you were talking about, right? So even if you can come across as the saintly martyr in the relationship, the rescuer, you're the one who's always right, and the partner is the one that's always wrong and misbehaving and acting up and being immature and blah, 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 that it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand you crave that role because it keeps you in that position, but on the other hand you get tired of it because you are enacting the thing that you wish someone else would do for you, which is someone to rescue you, right? And so you're always going to feel that friction because you're riding that edge between taking responsibility for someone else in the hopes that they will turn around and take responsibility for you, and it just doesn't work that way.
No. And this is I'll self-disclose. This is some of the things that I've struggled with and I've had to wrestle with. And so I talk from a lot of experience in terms of I had to step into things with my partners and say, look, I got to stop rescuing you and you're going to have to deal with this. And that was hard for me because it felt so good to be this idolized savior who can come in and solve these problems. But it also costed me being an equal in the relationship. Right. It costed me when I struggled, then, I didn't have someone who I could go to and lean on to help support me through my issues. And I had to stuff things inside and do all these other unhealthy ways of coping with this because I tried to maintain that idealized role of the parent. But that's toxic. And you really have to work to kind of lower yourself back down to just being an equal partner and really defining what that looks like in your relationship. And that, I'll tell you, it's freaking hard work. Just as it's hard work for the person who's the one that acts all helpless and out of control and life's gonna, do some really terrible things to them, for them to kind of deal with and tolerate those emotions that are going on and build their own resilience and confidence to take care of things themselves. And that's also hard work, but it's possible, even if you have these different dynamics in your relationship, for you to kind of meet each other and to start to have that partnership where you have that real, true intimacy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So we can move on to the third part, which I feel is sexiness and desirability. And I think if I know we've talked a lot about the previous two, but I think if you are able to step into and acknowledgement and respect, or appreciation and respect, and then that opens up the door to support and nurturance. And then I think once you're in that place, it's a lot safer to talk about sexual desires and things that make you feel passionate and aroused and stimulated and sexy, because it's a much more safer environment and there's a lot more trust going on, particularly because sometimes, as a result of our conditioning, particularly in the United States, there can be some shame and or other things tied up in the subject of sexuality. And also there can be power dynamics tied up in the subjects of sexuality and things like that. And especially if we're talking about insecure relationships, sometimes sexuality becomes a power dynamic, and or it can become split, that sex isn't emotionally intimate, it's just physical or it's emotional, and they become these two disparate things. Whereas if we're looking at this in the context of a relationship where distance has grown, then we're looking to romance to be a way to bring sex and emotional connection, I'm imagining, together in a way that you feel more connected. Did you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, yeah, again, you're right on the money with this, right? When we split kind of into, we're just having physical sex, or I'm having sex to get emotional reassurance in our relationship, you're going into trouble territory. Really the key, as you talked about, is as is being kind of that third layer, you really have to have that safety, which comes from the trust and commitment and the security in the relationship. And that's where you see people who have secure attachment styles, or who have even been insecure and earn their secure attachment styles, when it comes into the bedroom and the sex life, there's a lot more spaciousness for them to explore their sexuality, to be open about things that they enjoy and things that please them, things that they're uncomfortable with, and be honest with their partners in a way that really cultivates a healthy sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And so and what you're talking about is so important. So I'll kind of let you continue, but I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, for sure. And I also feel like, so there's kind of two parts in my mind to this. The first part is, how do you cultivate like an overall air of desirability in the relationship? And then like specific things you can do on a special occasion, for example, or that you can do to generate like something meaningful around that is particular event, right? So the first, I think, is a general sense of desirability in the relationship. And, I think that it's sort of like what you were talking about before about appreciation, that it's like nonverbal appreciation. So I think in the relationships in which I felt the most desirable was when like I might just walk past my partner in the apartment or something like that, and I would have a sense that like he just couldn't keep his hands off me. And it wasn't like he was grabbing my ass or like coming on to me, but it was just like he might just like push my hair behind my ear, or maybe his finger just runs along the back of my hand. But it doesn't lead to anything, but it's just that those little moments, in those moments, you just feel like, wow, like I really can't be within 6 inches of him and he cannot keep his hands off me like in any way. And it doesn't have to mean that it leads to intercourse per se, but it's like, it's an affectual kind of sexiness and arousal. And sexiness is so much more than just sex. It's this energy. It's an energy exchange, it's about just being excited by being in someone's presence.
Yeah, and I want to add into that, right? Dr. John Gottman, he always jokes that anything before sex is foreplay,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so those little gestures while you're walking by in the kitchen, like that, my partner and I do it all the time. Well, we're sitting close on the couch, we're touching, we're cooking, we might rub each other's back or give a little kiss, and like it's small little things, and they're not necessarily going, oh, like I'm doing this so I can have sex later tonight. Mm-hmm. I'm doing it because I'm showing my affection for my partner, and that's really building kind of the safety for exploring and being sexual and being intimate, and really building that up and making your partner feel cherished and loved and that they're sexy. And this is another thing, right? I think we forget to compliment our partners on their physical body, or admire or slow down during sex and actually explore their bodies and cherish their bodies. And so that's another thing that you might want to explore is, how often am I telling my partner that I find them sexy or attractive? How often am I breaking the mold of what I normally do in sex and then exploring their bodies and taking my time and really cherishing, our sexuality during this journey we have together. And that's so important. And I think another thing that's really important as we're talking about safety is making sure that your partner can say no to sex, and for that to be okay. Because when there's pressure that the partner can't say no, we also run into trouble. And I call this the paradox of yes in saying in accepting no. Right? Because if your partner can say, no, I don't want to have sex tonight, you're a lot, and you aren't resentful. You don't shame them for that. You don't criticize them. They feel much safer to allow their sexuality to blossom in the relationship. And so I talk a lot about that with couples too, of really honoring where your sexual desires are and realize that they're not going to be on the same page sometimes. And sometimes your partner might want to be warmed up, or sometimes your partner just isn't feeling attractive and isn't wanting it that night, and to honor and respect that, and not see that as a personal rejection, which is what I see a lot with couples who struggle with this. And it becomes really personal when the reality is it's not necessarily very personal. If that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think too, there's a spectrum. Another thing that I might recommend doing, and this is something that can build, I think, anticipation, is having like a sexual inventory, like a fantasy inventory. So like, have you ever heard of the game Would You Rather?
Mm-hmm.
So, like this is getting more into the realms of like things you could do creatively to spice things up a little bit. But what if throughout, let's say 7 days prior to the day, you start having like a sexy text exchange, and you're like, would you rather this or would you rather that? And then you don't talk about it when you get home, and you let that be this sort of like this spicy, saucy sort of affair you're having on text. It's like it builds this sort of taboo thing that's going on between you. It's kind of mystery, and it's all going to come to some climactic thing, and you're not sure what, but your partner is gathering information throughout the week, and like it It kind of generates anticipation in such a way that, if you agree that we're going to create this sort of arousing space and we're going to share these things that we may not talk about normally, but this is a safe space in which to share them. And then later, once you, go through with this event or whatever you're planning, then you can talk about it openly. But like sometimes if you play with that edge of like, these are my private secret fantasies and I'm sharing them with the secret private affair I'm having with my boyfriend on text, as opposed to like the person I go home to. Sometimes you play with that taboo, and you play with that. You can play a little bit with that line between what is the openness versus what's kept private, right? And then sometimes you can do a sexual inventory, and then whatever information you gather becomes sort of like the building blocks of whatever you plan to do to create some romantic scenario. So like, for example, I'll share a personal example. I had someone I was dating once who was very into Star Wars, as am I. And so I created a game, like a board game, based on Star Wars trivia. And so you could roll the die and land on certain things. And if they answered correctly, there would be one kind of reward. And if they answered incorrectly, there'd be another kind of reward. And it involved alcohol and sugar and lingerie and chairs and other things. So all of these there was up to chance, like what kind of thing you would get. And then and there was also a level of playfulness in it. So, and playing with roles. So like, maybe I would have to strip one moment, but then he'd have to strip the next. And, so there's just like a way of being playful with it.
And really creative too, right? You're really building creativity that allows you to explore each other in new ways, right? You're able to experiment with these different roles. You're able to kind of experience each other in a different way. And I think kind of even with the texting thing, right? You're kind of building something different that's new and novel, which really kind of gets our hormones and our bodies going. And so, I mean, you're really speaking to the creativity that you can add into your sex life that can really make it fun and playful and like get the desire going. And so I love this. Yeah.
I did that once with a partner where we found each other on like OkCupid or something like that, and we pretended we were having an affair with one another. So we would like meet at locations, and there was no talking was allowed, but we were having an affair on each other with each other. So it was very funny until.
Yeah. But that's, I mean, again, you're talking about different ways to be with each other, different ways to experience each other. As long as you guys have really safe agreements about, okay, we're on OkCupid and we're not messaging other people, but we're messaging each other, right? That's
well, so the danger there was that he became a little bit weary of how well I was doing.
Okay.
Because he would try to trap me, like as the boyfriend self. He'd be like, wait, like, but I think I need to change the plans and I need to come meet you at this time. And I was like, can't do that because I've got plans with someone else. And so it would be funny because we would try to like capture each other, but it was like we knew it was each other that we were doing this with. So, and then we were like, okay, that we've reached our threshold with that game. But I think it can be fun when you play with the things, because oftentimes like our sexual fantasies may be things that we're afraid our partners aren't going to like, right? Or we're afraid it's going to be something that our partner is going to make our partner insecure or stimulate performance anxiety. And I think that, as long as you have established that appreciation and respect and you're able to receive support, you're at this place where you understand, like you said before, that if someone's voicing some desire sexually, it's not personal, right? Like, or it could be personal, could be something very specific about your partner that you enjoy sexually, right? But acknowledging that the desires of your partner may be something that they can bring to the table that enliven the relationship in a way, even if it's something you may not have considered.
Right. And I think what Brianna's really highlighting, right, is this is phase 3 because this is pretty vulnerable, right? You're bringing out the fantasies, you're bringing out kind of things that you get to experiment with who you are, you get to experiment with your sexuality, you get to role play, you get to do these different things that can really spice up your romance. And a lot of couples do them. And it's really vulnerable, right? Because it's very easy to just go, okay, we're going to have sex every few often and, and we'll see how that goes. But to actually be very intentional and kind of cultivate that space for sexuality and that desire and playfulness. And so that's something that you know, it really takes a lot of vulnerability to be open with that and still in relationship with each other, and work on it too. And another thing Brown was really highlighting too is figuring out what turns your partner on and what turns them off, right? Figuring out what those boundaries are. And that's, you know, figuring out their sexual maps, as Dr. Gottman would call it, and figuring out the touch or the things that they do or the things that you can do that really excites them, that makes them feel loved and cherished and sexy. And that's part of getting to know our partners. And there's apps that you can do. There's a great book called Come As You Are that helps talk a lot about this, figuring out what the gases, the things that turn your partner on, and the breaks, the things that turn your partner off. And you know, one of my clients, they had a conversation for 3 hours, you know, just exploring what they love, and they're experimenting with foods and chocolates and role plays and all these other things that they're like, oh my God, this is so amazing. Like, we get to experience each other in such different ways. And if something doesn't feel great, they're also comfortable enough to say, hey, I'm not enjoying this. Let's take a break, or let's do this differently. Because there is that safety, that trust, and that commitment. And so that's another really important thing. But this, I mean, when you get to this level, it is a lot of fun, and it's awesome. So that's great.
And it's also, I think, part of taking command of your own sexuality as well. Because I know from the female perspective, perhaps, that women have a tendency to hand their sexuality over to their partners and expect them to figure it out. And that gets you into trouble because you don't know how to name what it is that you want or that you desire. So I think we probably need to wrap it up pretty soon, but I would just add to that part of it too is knowing your own can become an exploration process of knowing your own sexuality and being able to own it for yourself, and then bringing it to the relationship. And you can learn that in the context of the relationship, but being aware of that you come to it with your own set of tools, I guess I would say.
Well, yeah. And I realize there's a lot of sexual shame out there, right? There's a lot of shame about bodies or sex. And you know, particularly with females, I've seen a lot of that. And that shame shows up in, well, I shouldn't be masturbating, or I shouldn't be touching myself. I shouldn't be exploring these things. And that inhibits your sexuality. And so I really want to encourage you to explore what that shame is with someone who's safe, whether that's a coach or a counselor, or if your partner and you can have those types of conversations, and then experiment with what's it like to kind of be more intimate with yourself and figure out what turns you on and what turns you off. And as for guys, another thing that I see is their performance anxiety, right? Oh, is she having an orgasm this time? You know, is she able to have an orgasm before I am? That takes you out of the moment, right? You're not actually cherishing your partner. You're focused on your performance. And that's, to me, that's not sex. That's just a game, right? And I really want to encourage you as a guy to get into your physical sensations, feel different parts of your body, right? And this is where, if you are really driven, you can start to get into multi-orgasmic males. And like, there's books on that. I have some of my clients that are doing some of that stuff. That's some of the stuff I've experimented with myself. And you really start to get to experience your sexuality on a whole new level. It takes a lot of work, but man, it can be a lot of fun. And especially when you take that pressure off yourself, because you actually get to be in the moment with your partner and get to experience these sensations that are absolutely amazing. So that's the last little thing I'll put on that. And then, you know, maybe it's time for us to kind of wrap up and highlight on things they can actually do on this day. And then we'll kind of finish up. So
yeah. Well, so I would say, you know, realize that it's not just one day, that it's a culmination of things, and that's something you want to be cultivating all the time. But I would say, if you know that you want that particular day to be special, that I would say maybe it could be more than, but I would say at least a week in advance, start building the foreplay, like start building the seduction. I would take a sexual inventory. I might create some anticipation around it and add some creativity to it. You know, romance is really about also, when we talk about acknowledgement, it's about knowing your partner very well, and that whatever creativity you bring to whatever you decide to put together becomes a reflection of how well you know them. And that's what's really going to turn them on, like they feeling seen.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, that's so important. And, you know, going back to this stuff of on that day, you know, talking about the things you appreciate about them. Actually, one of the interesting things I do with couples, particularly when I start with them, I actually get a reflection of their history, right? And I call this the story of us, and talk about on this date or whatever you go on, and bring up, what were your favorite memories together? What were the things that you really cherished about each other? Don't go into the difficult conflicts. Don't go down that negative road, but really just focus on the things you really love. And that'll bring up some of those feelings that then allow you also to connect and start appreciating each other and really getting close emotionally. And then the real work and the intentionality is kind of more of what Brianna and I are talking about throughout this entire conversation. That can really make not only your relationship special on this day, but make it special throughout the year.
Yeah. And that's really the goal, isn't it?
That is the goal.
So now I think we can probably share a little bit about if people want to learn more about who we are and what we have to offer along these lines. I will share that if I work primarily with individuals that struggle with insecure attachments. So if you're interested in learning more about your attachment style or what attachment style you may have, I'd encourage you to click the link below, which will lead you to an attachment styles quiz and give you a lot more detailed information about that.
And I typically work more with couples, even if they have these anxious and avoidant attachment styles. I'm really taking these insecurities and trying to bridge that gap. And so one of the tools that I'm going to be offering you is what I call the Intimacy 5 Challenge. And these are 5 challenges they're actually pretty difficult because they're going to challenge you to get outside your comfort zone. And I want you to be really kind and compassionate as you're doing these challenges. And really experiment with your sexuality, experiment with what it's like to be close. You're going to have internal resistances and just let them be there and try to tolerate them and still be close to your partner. And that's where you're going to start to build the capacity to really be close. And so this Intimacy 5 Challenge, it's really amazing, and it'll be in the link below. Check it out and then let me know what you think of it.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, and make sure you come back because Kyle and I are going to be addressing more questions.
We'll see you soon.